So we have, I get the great opportunity to interview two very distinguished gentlemen here. I know most of you know them. Richard was the 71st Secretary of the Navy, Rhodes Scholar, Yale Law School graduate, and clerked for Justice, Supreme Court Justice Byron White. And DA, of course, Dean Emeritus Johns Hopkins, Presidential Medal of Freedom, 17 honorary degrees, and then that thing about smallpox. If anybody here needs an introduction on either of these two people, you're probably in the wrong room, so check your schedule. They are speaking today on behalf of themselves, not any of the centers they represent or work at or whatever. We're just having a discussion here like we'd have sitting in a coffee house or a bar, and y'all are welcome to listen in. But we're going to discuss several different issues, and the first question I have is for Richard. An article I read this week I found fascinating this weekend. It says the Department of Defense has embarked on a challenging program to enhance its capabilities to defend against biological warfare. Now, y'all know about that program, right? But let me just read you one sentence from this article. The program includes, among other things, the development and fielding of state-of-the-art biodetectors, the creation and designated of select military units for expertise in medical prophylaxis, hazard mitigation, decontamination, investments in vaccine and antibiotic research, development, stockpiling, refinement, acquisition of masks, and improvements in air filtration system to prevent infection by inhalation, improved intelligence collection analysis, enhanced training, development of doctrine regarding how to preempt and, when necessary, respond to a biological attack. That was all one sentence. Victor Hugo would be proud. Now, you're familiar with that, right? That was an article written in August of 1997 by Richard Danzig in JAMA. 97. How are we doing, Richard?
Well, first off, let me say that I'm really grateful to all of you for being here in UPMC. I had some wonders about why anybody would want me to supplement DA's views in this panel. But I got two hints in the course of the lunch, which I just want to observe. One was the serving of a decadent dessert. And the second was Randy's question to Gene, which I thought was well answered. You really need a second opinion, even if they're kooks, and I'm delighted to be the second person on this panel. With respect to the article that you mentioned, Randy, a paper I did with jointly with Pam Burkowski for JAMA, I think the progress we've made, not just in the Department of Defense, but generally, has been significant, but clearly inadequate to the problem. If we had a major biological attack, say a kilo of anthrax dispersed in a reasonably efficient way, either in a civilian context or against a military target like a port, I think we'd find that our capabilities for dealing with it were inadequate to the task. So I'm glad we got started what we got started. I think we have made real progress, but measured against the nature of the challenge, we're still quite far away from where we should be.
Thank you. DA, I was also reading your recent article that you published last month. And you were talking about what it was like being at HHS during the time period that Gene was talking about, and some of the concerns. And then in your article, you were questioning how much progress had really been made. One of the things that I found very interesting about, can we answer some fundamental questions? If there were this, say, kilogram of dry powdered anthrax released in a major city, do we really know what to tell the American people right now? You said, do you get on the subway or don't you? Do you what do you do? Explain a little bit more what you had in your article here.
Well, I think some of the most anxiety-provoking moments occurred right after 9/11. As I was called in by the Secretary and asked to be of some help. At that time, right after 9/11, 5 days later, it was a Sunday evening, and he informed me and his senior staff at that point that there were intelligence intercepts which suggested there was going to be a second attack and it was likely to be biological. At that time, our center was very new. It was about 3 years old. CDC was finally adding some people specific to the area of biodefense. There was very little research going on anywhere. And certainly the cities and counties were totally unprepared to do anything of a major sort. It was really other than what FEMA had been able to induce with regard to emergency response. And the question that bothered me from that point on was, and which I think we probably ask each other daily, what do we do if tomorrow the shoe drops? Well, then we did have anthrax was released. And you saw brief bits that Gene showed from Secretary Thompson and his concern and being unsure but reassuring. And, but then we got, it was quite clear with the New York cases that we had anthrax and it was an attack. At that point, what do we do? And we could predict from the turbulence that was already about us that there was going to be chaos. And the country was already really having a lot of trouble, and white powders were being found everywhere. People were being evacuated from buildings. They were being taken out in the back lot and hosed down, and really a strange set of circumstances. I think powders were being found everywhere. Powdered sugar was being tested along with everything else. But the one question that we ask ourselves, what do we do if tomorrow we have an attack? What do we advise that be done, and how do we handle it? Well, it's quite clear that if we're going to do anything, that those at the operating level, states and cities, have got to be fully informed as to what the strategy is and what might be done. And we have to have some decision at the national level and some agreement as to what it is we want to do. It's 10 years since we've had anthrax, the anthrax attack. And just to illustrate what some of the questions are. The question is, do we evacuate the city, or do we tell everybody to shelter in place? But for how long? The anthrax falls on the ground, it's not destroyed, it's there. And what do we say? There are three different views on this. One, shelter in place, other is to evacuate, and the third is it probably isn't significant or a significant risk. And we don't have the data to back this up. And then just to conclude, really, we hoped at one point we'd have a vaccine that would be a recombinant anthrax vaccine, which could be widely utilized. And that was 10 years ago. And we don't have a vaccine that is the one we have now requires 7 doses of vaccine to protect. And what do we do about antibiotics? And how widely do we use these? It's recommended they be given for 60 days. But what do we do? People get sick just from the antibiotics. What we need is a plan. And I think we all have to, there has to be a buying into what it is we're going to do. Other than that, we're going to have all sorts of different experts offering all sorts of different advice. And I think chaos.
Okay, DA, you brought up a bunch of interesting issues I'd like to jump into a little bit. One of the big issues, and I'm sorry our colleague Peter Utro couldn't be here today because this is his favorite subject about cleanup and problems with standards and how we're going to do it. And I know a lot of people refer back to some studies done by the Army. And there's one that people refer to a lot that said, well, secondary aerosolization probably wouldn't be a big problem. Well, one of the other things I came across this weekend was one of the first documents I ever read about the subject in '94, Biological Weapons Proliferation. It's actually the pre-publication study. And I just got to tell you who were some of the young people working on this. Carol Linda, David Franz, and Gerald Parker. '94. But the one sticky that was still in there when I pulled it out of this old box this weekend was for paragraph 2.1.4. BW agents are not persistent agents, was the topic of the paragraph. And then the part that I had highlighted down here was what caught my attention, though. It says, therefore, BW agents are unlikely to pose a significant battlefield casualty problem after the primary cloud has passed. And then it references 3 classified studies. A significant battlefield casualty problem. That's a lot different than Grand Central Station or Union Station. And so I would be careful when, what's surprising me, Dia, is a decade later, I don't think we still know the answer. And I understand there's research going on. I know EPA's done a lot of work on small scale where they get the drums from Africa or whatever, and they got to clean that up. But either of you like to make any comments about this whole issue, the economic implications of anthrax used as an area denial weapon in a city or whatever?
Sure. Well, there are already obviously several things on the table here. Let me see if I can just sort a few of them out and give you my view with respect to them. First, I think you're quite right, Randy, to focus on the economic consequences. I think one of the evolutions for me since 9/11 is that most of us, I think, originally tended to think about biological weapons in the context of deaths and consequences like that. More and more, I think others have come to think of it not so much as a weapon of mass destruction in terms of killing, but as a weapon of mass disruption and the consequences, for example, of the kilo we've talked about of anthrax being distributed over Manhattan might be felt very substantially in terms of the nation's economy. So I think you're right to focus this. I think there's a certain charm, Randy, to your going back to these articles in the 1990s. Personally, I think when you cite my JAMA article, you probably doubled my readership here, so I'm grateful to you. But beyond that, I think you're right that we still have a considerable degree of uncertainty, and DA is, I think, pointing to a very important thing. When he says we need more science studies here in a variety of ways, the issues here really are not money, it's a question of focus. I mean, I'll take an even more elementary thing. Do we advise citizens after this anthrax attack to vacuum or not? Do we advise them to stay indoors and leave their windows open or close them? Now, if you put these questions to people, the general answer is, well, it depends. I'd need to know a lot more about the agent. The point I would make is that people are going to look to government for advice in the wake of an attack without us typically knowing a lot more about the agent. The various studies that would be required to provide a very finely grained scientific answer aren't there. So, and won't be there at the time in terms of understanding the agent that's out there. So my view is we ought to invest a small amount of money to do some serious studies of this kind, which by and large have not, to my mind, been on the agenda. And finally, I just would add, in terms of the planning, the issue that DA raised, there is both a deep problem and a more superficial problem. The deep problem is our federalist system. We have extreme unclarity about what happens with a security event that occurs in a domestic health context as compared with a security event that occurs abroad. And if you look at the DHS regulations and so forth on this, they're very muddy about the federal role. It's in support of the local official. But realistically, that hugely complicates the planning problem. The more superficial problem is, I think, that decision makers have tended, in my view, to focus on 1- and 2-day exercises about 1- and 2-day kinds of issues, and then to try and build a national framework that would be one size fits all. And in my view, what we ought to do is work in a lot greater depth around 1 or 2 cities like New York and perhaps Washington or Los Angeles that may be representative of these kinds of problems and work them through over a period much longer than a day or two. That is to say, much longer than what the events that would occur in the first day or two, and in a much richer level of detail. And negotiate a path for those 1 or 2 cities, and then enable other cities to opt into that model or choose other things. That's a rather different approach than we're pursuing now.
You mentioned the funding on this research about cleanup. Of course, my favorite thing about that is the EPA's annual budget to do that research is 50% of what the budget is for Marine Corps marching bands. You'll hear Senator Talent talk to you later this afternoon about priorities and how we all know the fiscal environment we're headed into, but this is an issue of priorities. As the former Secretary of the Navy, I got to say I love Marine Corps marching bands, but when I look at those priorities and the long-term security for my kids and grandkids, I worry about that even if you tripled EPA's budget, it would still round off to zero in many programs in DOD.
I would cut other things first, like Army marching bands, but
Oh, yeah. They need help, right? And DA, so you talk about when you talk about plans in your articles, now maybe it's just my perception, I got the idea you were talking about a federal plan or a national plan. Richard's talking about we should test this, and he's written about this quite a bit, about let's test it in 1 or 2 cities and get it right, which is more somewhat of a military approach. You develop the doctrine and everything, and then other people can learn from it instead of trying to do everything at once across the country. What's your opinion of that approach?
Well, I don't think we're ever going to have answers. We're going to be doing research, and there are always more questions, and the research could be profitably inform us as we move ahead. But I think one has to pick a time like right now. What are we going to do on the best knowledge we have? We've got to have a plan, and we will not know the answers to it. The big problem we have trying to get that decision made is something I would call interagency committee-itis, which I think is virtually epidemic and spreading. So that I think the idea of trying to get some sort of decision and really plan and framework is not easy, and yet it's going to have to, we're going to have to come to that, and we really, if we have something happen tomorrow, we've got to have answers, and I think Gene Meserve has made it quite clear. They're going to look for answers, they're going to look for statements, and if we're not in a position to provide some sort of valid information and advice as to what we believe should be done based on what, I think it's going to be chaos.
Well, communications is one of the things I had on my list here, DA. And, you know, Gene made a good point about if government officials telling us, and then you have another government official saying, and of course our concern is federal official, state official, local official saying different things. It bothers me in this page 2 of the Washington Post yesterday, there was an article that said 1 of 10 families in America don't get childhood vaccines for the children on the schedule that's recommended. 1 in 10 families. After we had enough H1N1 vaccine in 2009, only 38% of Americans got it. I'm concerned if they're hearing conflicting things about, and particularly how about if we had a medical countermeasure that was approved under the emergency use authorization? Didn't even have full FDA approval. But yet we thought with the nature of the event, what can we do to improve our communications capability? I think CDC has done a far better job, we saw it in H1N1, of having the system to get out information. But the information that's got to flow through those pipelines, you know, we're going to develop all these medical countermeasures at great expense, but if people aren't going to take them, how are we going to deal with that, DA? I mean, you had to convince a lot of people to get smallpox vaccines one time, right? And it was a pretty dangerous vaccine,
Sure
actually.
did. Well, yeah, I think the thing of it is, I think you've got to decide on what is the best, our best judgment as to what the steps are to be taken. And there's going to be disagreement, but somehow or other, I think there's got to be some sort of authoritative kind of approach to this. And that is needed, and it's needed now. Not with research going on for 5 or 10 years, but it may inform research that may modify what's there. But I think this is one part of the problem. There's a second problem. Recommendation right now from CDC, what do you do with an anthrax attack? Well, you want to give a vaccine at 0, 15, and 30 days, and begin everybody who might have been exposed on an antibiotic for 60 days. Can you imagine any city in America that's prepared today to vaccinate all or a substantial part of its citizens once, let alone 3 times? Is it possible? Do we have any city in America that's really prepared now to make an antibiotic available efficiently throughout the whole of a city very quickly? No, we don't have either of these. We're still waffling around trying to come up with an answer. What I worry about is what I worried about right after 9/11. Suppose something happens tomorrow, what are we going to do? And the penalty for doing nothing is going to be chaos.
let me agree with that, and I think, DA, you're quite right to keep hammering away at the question, what do we do if this occurred today? For all we know, an attack occurred an hour ago and we don't yet know it. We have to be prepared against those contingencies. On the narrow, specific question you asked, Randy, about communication, I'll just give you a sort of top three from my standpoint that I've come to after thinking about it some. The first is people frequently say, can we do anything in advance to educate people a lot? And my view is, in general, the answer to that is no. There's too much noise out there. People discount the threat too much. I wouldn't invest heavily in efforts to educate the general public now. The second is the point DA keeps raising, which is what can we prepare now to better inform people at that moment? And my view is definitely yes, through the kinds of preparation that we're talking about, even recognizing huge amounts of uncertainty. Part of the problem is the cultural disinclination of scientists to offer opinions on anything they don't have precision about. But the reality for policymakers is that in the event they will need to offer some views. And so we better prepare, because views that are prepared are a whole lot better than views that are impromptu. The third proposition, though, is that in the circumstance where people are facing this kind of catastrophe, the kind of question Carol raised earlier to Jean about social networks and so on is right, and was right even before we had Twitter and Facebook and all those things, if you can remember back to that antique time when some of us were writing JAMA articles. The reality is that it has always been the case, the social science literature shows, that people look to opinion leaders outside of government, to their local doctors, to their priests, to authoritative figures outside of government, and they look to that source to validate or invalidate what the government is saying. And we need to think more effectively, given both the technologies that Carol references, but also the deep nature of people in these contexts, about how we reach those groups and educate them in advance and tie them in.
Let's move a little bit to the future. Unfortunately, it may not be far into the future. One of the things in the last year of work that has really gotten my attention is, and it all began at the J. Craig Venter Institute in April of 2010, talking to a group of your scientists up there. And I had a great experience of having lunch with 7 of the top scientists in the world there. And we asked the question, how many people in this room, 7 people sitting there, can make smallpox in this laboratory? And 3 raised their hands, and 1 was kind of, and I, oh, well, you know, maybe they're just, you know. And then when I asked the same question later at HHS to a group of scientists, it was kind of like, well, yeah. It's not that difficult anymore, Randy. And then when finding out about, one of the top scientists in NIH a couple months ago told me that making anthrax or plague or tularemia that's resistant to our medical countermeasures is undergraduate level work. It's not graduate level work, it's undergraduate level work. Those 2 things, thinking about the future, really kind of gotten my attention here in the past few months. And I got some of the top scientists in the government, some of the top scientists out of government seem to be that, yes, this is not a problem. DA, is that the future we're looking at?
Well, I think it's quite obvious that we can very easily conjure up all sorts of things that scientists might do accidentally or not accidentally that could have considerable implications. And the question is, how do you anticipate what possibly might be forthcoming? And I think it's very frustrating to think through this and figure out what can be done. We can look to long-term, broader application. I think the research is going on, let's say, antibiotics, which will be sort of a universal antibiotic or antiviral agents. These are possible. I think it's a long way down the road. But in fact, I guess as we contemplated this, we could imagine all the different things that people might do in their laboratories, do easily now. And what we really needed was to make sure that we've got a constructive base to work from in terms of countering them. And that is from the community up, that we've got organization, communication, and what have you. And we're in a position to cope. On the other side is that we should be doing something with regard to laboratories that could very rapidly characterize an organism, be in the position to move rapidly on to developing a vaccine and proceeding. to production. We don't have that structure at the present time. We've got the manufacturers, we've got research people, but something of a continuity of research, production, getting something prepared for production and producing itself. And that we could do, and I think that's been talked about, but I think as yet that sort of an organization has yet to be funded.
I want to first take this rare opportunity to put in a plug for my profession of lawyers. You know, half the scientists you talk to, Randy, might be able to produce smallpox. None of the lawyers would. I think, though, that the question, and I think this is where you're pointing, Randy, is not where we are today, but where we're likely to be a decade from now and in the years after that. Because when we design these systems, we design defenses that take a long while to implement and then wind up enduring for a long while. And in my view, we have to take account of the fact that synthetic biology and other advances in biology are making the problem vastly more complicated. So to pick a very particular example, I think rather admirably and creatively, when the President announced in his State of the Union address and I think it was 2003 or 2004, that we were going to have a biodetection system, people went out there and created a biodetection system, most of them quite surprised to learn from the President that this was something they were going to do. That system, though, is dependent on notions of identifying in advance which pathogens you're going to look for in the atmosphere. And I think the implication of the synthetic biology and others is that we no longer realistically are going to be able to depend on a threat list like we've historically had. And my sense, in response to your comments, DA, is that we can't continue on the assumption that we can make good predictions and then test for particular things. So that gives you the great challenge. How do you design a detection system if you know that you don't know what you're trying to detect? But I think actually that can be answered. In my own view, and I've been encouraging some work in the Department of Homeland Security and elsewhere on this, is that the technology is developing both through things like the IBIS 3000 machinery or the DARPA predictive health diagnosis program, where we may be able to sample human beings on a regular basis, for example, policemen and firemen, as they go off shifts, and find out whether they've been infected, and then link that back to, with GPS systems, to finding out whether there's a mass locale concentration of infection. I only offer this as an example of the evolution potentially of the technology to a system in which we don't have to predict, but can observe by looking closely at the human being what's happened. And it's that kind of, I think, technological innovation against the expectation of technological innovation on the offensive side that we need to get into.
Yeah, and I guess it's maybe our military backgrounds, Richard, but the whole thing about right now the offense has a great advantage, but I think that the science technology can turn that around, so the defense does, but it's a long-term commitment, and getting that balanced funding over a number of years to reach that is critically important, because when you see what's available today and how long it's going to take us to get ready for the threat a decade from now, I guess that troubles me. If there's any questions in the audience, please stick up your hand.
And Randy, if I could just
yes.
insert one sentence here, although it may be like my sentence in my article, run on here. The cyber is also suggestive. It's so much the issue du jour, but the tendency can be, oh, well, I'll defend my cyber system against viruses, or a suggestive word, by identifying what's out there and create safety firewalls against that or immediate responses for disabling it. But I think people are increasingly realizing that, no, you need something that gives you a more, to use a medical metaphor, adaptive immunity, more flexible, more capable of responding to what you didn't already observe or what you could predict. And that's where I think we need to get to.
It's interesting that you mentioned cyber. I think one thing that's very in parallel with cyber and the biothreat is the lack of attribution. Some people think we can protect our computers by having antiviruses and firewalls, whatever. What we really need is attribution. We need to know who's coming into our computer system so we can either take criminal action or national security action, one or the other. And attribution is an area that we don't have time to get into today, so I don't see any hands, so I got one last question, and then I'm going to want to save just a minute for, oh, got a question, please, sir.
It's quite possible to have things that look like surgical masks, but actually filter out the particles of the size that we are talking about, and you can just put them on. And again, greatly reduce the impact of the agent without knowing what it is. And I think these things should be a part of our thinking, and I'm afraid they are still excluded from that. Thank you.
I think you're right. And I think that if you look at the military side of the equation, we naturally gravitate to those solutions, protecting headquarters and providing MOP gear, personnel protection systems. So I think this is one of a number of rich areas, and I think you're also right in pointing to the fact that the specific example illustrates a more general phenomenon, which is that we have ways of thinking as doctors, as soldiers, as lawyers, that blinker our possibilities. And the problem is, as is now becoming a more fashionable term, a wicked one that laps over many disciplines and requires many different modes of thought. So breaking out of the boundaries of our professional modalities is, I think, very important. So I applaud the line of thought you're expressing. And I think Gigi did too, because after she heard you begin, she decided to give you the microphone.
I think in particular we have had a number of meetings with people in the building trades and the question of installing filters and the practicality and what you could do and the costs. And it really looks like a lot more could be done than is now being done. The problem is, can you get the cooperation of building management and so forth to, one, insist on installment, and then two, periodically having somebody look at the filters and what have you at least every year. And but this it's been talked about as, could you actually mandate this in terms of building codes, and so that has been discussed, and I think it's still a warm topic. It's very good.
Oh, one more question we have time for, so go ahead.
Yeah, quick question. A couple of references in the panel to the need for long-term funding for doing things to address certain problems. But if you take a look around at the funding landscape today, whether in government or outside of government, biosecurity in particular, seems to be sort of yesterday's issue or the been there, done that issue. What's your sense on the panel of the capability and the interest to make the kind of investments that you were just saying were needed on the part of government and non-governmental funders?
Well, looking at the financial side, I think the one thing that has been a bit of a problem has been that most of this area has been dominated by physicists who are a very capable group of physicists, but really not much knowledge of the biological side, and they tend to focus more on that which they can cope with within their own discipline rather than the biological side. So I think it's been a problem of making the case, and I think the point has been made, for example, as the head of the Office of Science and Technology Policy has been a physicist going back now a number of years, and even though it's been advised that maybe we ought to have a biologist in that position because of the importance of the biological area, not only with regard to BW, but broadly in terms of the economy and what have you. So I think we need more biologists, I think, at high levels for the case to really be made.
I would just add that I think we're all recognizing something that is manifested in many other areas, which is that the funding investments tend to respond to fashions. They tend to respond to the excitements of the moment and have lingering longer-term consequences. And that's not just true of the biology issue. I mean, if you took the military funding in general and looked at the drama and the strong pressure to decrease the military budgets in 1992, and then looked at the strong pushes in 2002 in the opposite direction, and look again at what's likely to happen in the near term, you see this roller coaster effect. What's incumbent on all of us is when the roller coaster is at a point where, for one reason or another, money is being poured in to try and use it effectively and make the most of that opportunity. And when the roller coaster is going down, Tom in his talk talked about doing more with less. I think that probably is not achievable. I think the likelihood is we will do less with less. But I think then the question is which less and how. And many of the ideas, like the planning ideas we were talking about, don't really require very substantial funding. So I think we are going to see a diminution in attention. We are seeing it. I accept that as a fact of life, even while I try and resist it in a variety of ways. But I think we will endure through this, and the challenge for us is to prepare ourselves as best we can against the day, which I'm afraid will eventually come, where some other crisis, an attack or whatever, suddenly revives the passion for this. And the question will be, how well did we use these years in the desert to prepare ourselves for that moment?
1 minute. You each have to charge this audience about where we should be focused on the future.
Well, since DA is senior to me, he's got to go first.
Well, I think I would regard really a couple of points as being important. One is, I think there needs to be clear leadership. Right now we have agencies across government involved in a little bit in a number of different ways, and I think we're lacking in terms of an overall leadership direction. Until we have that, I think we're really not going to be able to make the progress. I think we're going to be milling around without getting very far. There are good people at all different levels. The difficulty is that there does not seem to be that type of overall leadership that I think makes a difference, and this is what the National Defense Science Board pointed out in their review.
I'll just offer a 1, 2, 3. One, let's do the kind of planning that DA started talking about and that Randy and I think both very much are supporting. The planning about real consequential decisions that would be made in the wake of a substantial attack, and also how we would advise our citizenry and the like. A second thing that I would mention that has not come up in this discussion is the policing problem. For me, one of the biggest difficulties associated with biological weapons is that when we talk about them, we're not just talking about terrorists using these weapons like terrorists might get a nuclear weapon. We're talking about terrorists acquiring the ability to produce these weapons. And that then gives them an ability to repeatedly attack. I've called this reload. The question for our policing agencies is, how would you thwart repeated attacks? How do you find soon enough where this attack is coming from that you could plausibly interdict it while it's going on? There is nothing in our present arsenal that really focuses on that, and our detection systems, because of the delay between time of attack and time of actual awareness that the attack has occurred, don't really help us there, and they don't help us to localize where it came from or how it's actually being administered. So I would give that a very big priority. It hasn't come out in this discussion. And third and last, and more generally, I would love to see a little more harmony in the field in the discussion of the issues and why this is such an important problem. For me, it is not, as some have suggested, that we can say that an attack will occur in a particular period, or it is not our concerns about jihadi Islam and the like. It's that the march of technology, which is a wonderful thing in this area, also carries with it this very substantial cost and risk. And we cannot say who will pick up these weapons and use them. We cannot say when they will be used. We cannot say how they will be used. We can only give examples of how this might happen. All that is in the very uncertain and, in my view, unpredictable future. But what we can say is that we know from experience that when technologies like this can be harnessed as weapons, they very likely will be. And the failure on our part will be if we don't prepare against that day. It's not a failure to predict in some very concrete way and prepare against some single very concrete scenario and time and place. It's the failure to put the intellectual capital and the preparatory work in terms of goods and ideas in our cupboard so that we can take it out when we need it. To turn to that cupboard and find it bare would, in my view, be a failing not only of national leadership generally, but of everybody in this room.
Richard, DA, thank you very much.
Thank you.